Hello and welcome to the Producer Podcast. I'm your host, Micah Versman, and with me today is Hannah Bartlett. I first met Hannah a number of years ago at the Motion University on-set experience, where she was one of the instructors. Today she continues to work with Motion University, as well as being the creative producer at Bartlett Idea Co. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thanks for having me on, Micah.
Great to connect this way. So everybody gets tired of answering this question, but you kind of have to when it's a film podcast. So how did you first get started making film?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Honestly, probably the same way that a lot of other people have, is just starting out with doing backyard films with my siblings and with friends. I got my first digital camera when I was 16 and just loved being able to create photos, which then turned into doing video. And some friends and I actually took 2.5 years to create a feature film. And it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And definitely not something I would ever want to publish. But we learned a lot through the process. And from there is kind of when I started getting more into I really enjoy doing this. I want to keep doing this at the time just as a hobby. But I did start getting more into doing a short documentary and then doing some short client work and that type of thing. And that's around the time in 2014 when Andrew and I, along with my mom, started Motion University. And that's really what got us going into oh, wow, okay, we love doing this. It's a great community to work with. We learned a lot. And that got me really started more into doing the promotional filmmaking. So yeah, I've been doing that full time since 2016.
Cool. Now, getting started, obviously at first, nobody really knows what they want to pursue. But was the producer realm what you kind of very early on wanted to pursue, or did that come about later?
I would say the first thing that attracted me to film was probably more the camera side of things.
Okay.
When we did the backyard stuff, just the fun stuff with friends or whatever, I was always the one behind the camera. And usually editing as well. So that's kind of interesting to me because I feel like I use both the right and left side of my brain, have a little bit of the creative in there, but also some of that, organizational and stuff too. So I think what first got me into it was really more the camera and the editing and that type of thing. As I got working more with Andrew and started going into it more, thinking of it as a career and doing it more full time with Andrew, his strong point is really creative. He's full right brain, visionary, he's great at that. And I'm a firstborn. I tend to think more black and white. So I naturally started kind of going towards more the organizational, the budget, the communication, that type of thing, especially in working with Andrew, because we were just a really good team in that way. So I feel like those strengths of mine and the interest in that kind of slowly developed as we got going more into doing filmmaking full time.
So I'm curious, because at Bartlett Idea Co, you're called the creative producer, and I've never heard that term used before. So at least with Bartlett Idea Co, what does creative producer mean?
Yeah. So to give a little context, my husband Andrew and I own Bartlett Idea Company. And for us two, we're both the only full-time employees. We hire other people in per project based on the needs of the project. But we're the full-time folks at Bartlett Idea Company. And so I think part of the reason was just because the two of us, being small business owners and working together so closely on this, we both do have a lot of input on different parts of different projects. So, there's times when I'll have some creative input, but at the same time, I also do a lot of the editing. So I'm the lead editor for the company, right? So I'm not just doing numbers and organizational stuff, but also having input and working on the editing side or, if he directs basically all of our projects, but I'll often give input or thoughts, critique on the creative side of stuff too. So I think really with that title, I'm not sure if there's an official definition to it, but for us, just kind of sharing that I am the producer, but also, we own the company together and really work together on all aspects of the different projects.
Neat. So, what is it about a project that gets you excited?
Right. Wow, it's a great question. I would say one thing that I love about film and producing is just that every project is so different. I love that. It's never like the same thing, or even if you have a repeat client or, you're working with the same people again, it's still every time is different. You're doing a different project with a different storyline and all of that. So I love that every project is different. Also, for me personally, I really love interacting with people. I love people. I love communication. I'm an extrovert. I love being on set. There's just that vibe of being on set when it's not crazy stressful. Every set is stressful, but there have been some sets where it's got pretty crazy stressful. And, at that point, you're just like trying to get things done. But overall, like, I just love being on set. I love being in charge of a team, kind of like just leading that team into making the project. And I love organizing things. Another fun little details I do love, like looking up Airbnbs and organizing travel details, or, whatever it happens to be for that project. Like, that's really fun for me. I love researching and looking things up and kind of putting it all together, organizing it to be just a cohesive thing.
Cool. How do you balance work life and family life? Since obviously for you and Andrew, it can be very easy to not keep it separate, or maybe get so busy with a project that you're not able to devote time to it. So how do you find that balance?
Right. It's tough. It's really tough to find the balance. I think especially, no matter what stage of life you're at, but especially if you're married or have kids or whatever. We don't have kids yet, but I do feel like one day when we do have a family, like, I'll probably be working less, right? Like, ultimately, from a big picture perspective, God and my family are the most important to me. So if work needs to take a back seat on that, then it will. I'll do that less. But right now, I feel like in the season of life for Andrew and I, like, I'm learning so much about this, just the balance. It's really an everyday thing. And one of the things that I've had to work on doing, and I still don't totally have this down, but really is almost, you have to produce your life as well, in a sense of like thinking ahead, right? And for Andrew and I, I'm kind of producer of our life, not just the work, right? It's like, okay, let's think ahead. Where's our budget at? Like, do we need to go visit family or take a vacation or do stuff like that? And I think something important with that is to be intentional, because especially being a small business owner and working in film in general, life is just crazy. And it can be just full of work. And it's never really going to slow down, as much as you kind of think, oh, someday, we'll have all of our processes down. It'll be all organized and, it'll slow down. I mean, I think the film world in general is just crazy busy, and that can be a really good thing. But learning how to balance that, I think you have to really think ahead. Okay, we're going to take a vacation in the spring. You're thinking about the fall, right? And how you can manage your time that far ahead. Because once you're in the thick of it and you have client deadlines and you have things going on, you can't change the contract. You can't change those deadline dates, but you can be thinking ahead 3, 4, or 5 months down the road, and, maybe setting aside that time, if possible, for a family vacation or things like that. And also taking it a day at a time, because sometimes even if you have a deadline coming up, you need to be, no, tonight, we're going to go on a date, or we're going to have my family over, or some church friends, or whatever it happens to be. Sometimes you just have to force yourself to take a break and be okay with that, because there's always going to be that to-do list sitting there.
Yes.
And I feel like a couple other things that honestly, just in the past couple of months here that God's been showing me, is that you can come to the Lord with that balance and with those maybe stressors or whatever it happens to be. But just taking it a day at a time, giving it to God, and remembering what's most important. I also was just listening to a really interesting talk online about stress, and how stress, you need to view it as something positive instead of something negative. And I had never thought of it that way before. To me, stress was always like, oh no, like, I'm stressed, oh dear. Like, I need to, I never get a balance with the family life or whatever, but instead thinking of stress as like God created our bodies to deal with stress. And it can be, if you think of it positively, you're going to be more confident. You're actually going to be less stressed. And you're going to be, I think, able to manage that family balance a little better when you're able to think of stress in a more positive way of this stress is helping me. It's helping me be more bold, or it's helping me, my body prepare for, the 10 days of shooting we have ahead or whatever it happens to be, right? So that's been something that I've been wanting to work on, is just viewing it differently, kind of having more that eternal perspective and bringing it to the Lord, but then also getting enough sleep and eating healthy. That's something I'm kind of passionate about, because Andrew and I have both really struggled with that. Like, how do we get enough sleep when we have these deadlines and, there's a shoot coming up and I'm producing and the permits aren't coming back and people aren't responding and, these stressful situations. But really getting that sleep and eating right can help you be better in both areas, both in work, having a more clear mind to communicate with your crew and to deal with those situations that come up, but also in your family life, to not be so exhausted that you can't have that family and work balance.
That's good. And it's cool to hear the perspective of a married couple but without kids. So I thought maybe we jump into kind of the pre-production aspect. So when Andrew first comes to you with the creative concept for the project, how do you go about breaking that down from figuring out number of shoot days and all the different stuff that you need to know to put together a budget?
Right. No, that's really good. So I feel like I'm going to back up just a little bit to give context to our process.
Okay.
So for us, being, again, small business owners, and Andrew and I are the full-time employees. So we're the ones getting the clients. We're the ones doing the creative and a lot of the pre-production. And then we bring in crew based on like per project. So to start out, we both attend a discovery meeting with the client to talk about a lot of things. And so that's kind of where my role starts, is we're talking in the discovery meeting. What are they thinking for the project? What are their goals? Who's their audience? What are the dates that might work for them? A lot of those details, both on the creative and on like the producing side. So after the discovery meeting and we get a contract signed and all that worked through, I'll often start right away by like working on dates and interviewees, starting communication with the client to see who they would like to be interviewed and that type of thing. It really is a project by project basis, but that typically is how I start. Sometimes I'll start out right away with contacting crew that we think we're pretty sure we're going to want to have on the project to make sure that their dates are available. But really, before I can do too much, it's really important to me that Andrew has been able to do his creative. I really need him as the director to tell me what he wants. So usually after the discovery meeting, we get all those notes, all that info from the client, then he's able to go and do the creative, right? So typically what he does, since we do work in promotional filmmaking with clients, is he'll have a couple of different layouts. So he'll have one is what you would hear, right? So like what the interviewees would be saying. He wants the flow for them to start out with maybe introducing themselves or talking about what the problem is and then going into the solution, or whatever it happens to be. He'll kind of lay out the flow for what you'll be hearing. And then he'll have another graph that he'll usually make laying out the visual. So as they're talking about their hometown, he wants to see a drone shot of the city at sunset or whatever. So once he's able to like lay all of that, what you'll hear, what you'll see, all of his like creative direction out, then at that point is when I'm able to actually really dive into the details. And usually, working with clients, like in the contract and everything, of course, we'll have the budget and everything laid out. So a lot of times that is going to determine what we're able to do as far as crew or locations or travel or whatever it happens to be there. So I'll be kind of working on the budget throughout this process and discussing it with Andrew as well. But from there, I'll often go into working more on the interviewees. We had one project where the client really wanted to see and hear the creative before choosing who they wanted us to interview, because they wanted to know, it was a very big company, and so they had a lot of people to choose from. So they wanted to know who's going to be the best fit for this, right? So in that a case like that, we're not even starting on interviewees until he's done that creative. I'll also be working kind of simultaneously on the interviewees, on the locations, on if we need any actors, or a lot of times it's not actually like career actors that we're like bringing in. It's just, people that the client knows that work for the company that are going to be demonstrating different things or doing different things in the shots. And then often, because we are a small creative agency, I'm often ADing a project as well. So I'll usually like be working on scheduling and like figuring out the amount of days and how that's all going to fit and what's going to happen in each of those days. Either myself, or there's been, a couple of projects where I've been able to work with like a second AD or even a first. There was one project we did where I was just producing and, he was first ADing. So in that case, I'll still work closely with them just because I'm usually the one communicating with the client.
Yeah.
So I'll take the info from the client, work with the first AD, or if I'm ADing it, figuring out the scheduling. So a lot of that's happening simultaneously as there's emails flying back and forth, figuring out which locations are going to work out and all of that. And of course, the budget, I'll have a very general budget all laid out like ahead of time. And then as I work on more and more details, I'll be able to figure out, for example, locations, right? I'll often put some in the budget for locations at the beginning, but sometimes when you're working with the client, you don't have to pay for a location because you're using their factory or their location or whatever it is. And so as I go on in the project and working through those details, I'm able to make adjustments to the budget and try to add in as much detailed budgeting as I can, even if it's like gas or lodging or whatever, trying to figuring that out as detailed as I can ahead of time so that there's not as many surprises. There's always surprises on a film set, but minimizing that as much as possible, I do try to do ahead of time. And then one other thing too is that a lot of times, especially if it's a really big project, in our creative agency, we've done everything from just Andrew and I being on a project, a small local 2-person thing, to a much larger project where it's like 9 days of just shooting, not even including, prep days and days off and all that, with a crew of like 11 people total, including us. So there's a lot of range in there. But for some of the bigger projects, like what I did for that one larger one that we did earlier this year, was use whiteboards. So I'll, really kind of map out like, okay, how many days do we have and how many locations do we have and how are we going to rearrange this? Because you can easily on a whiteboard, just erase something and write it in another box or whatever if you need to. And kind of it can help your thought process as you're kind of figuring out all those details. So whiteboards is something that I'll use on occasion for the bigger projects. And then also for any size project, I use Google Drive. That's a big part of my process, is just the whole system, whether it be spreadsheets, Google Docs, or even just, uploading photos to Google Drive and like organizing them, pictures of the interviewees or of the location so that our DP can see it. I just love using that system for organization. And like I said, any size project, I found it to be super helpful. So that's a little bit about my process. I feel like it's a little different just being it's a small creative agency and Andrew and I do work so closely together on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was going to ask if you're like Andrew and a whiteboard person or if you have a different style of mapping out your process for a project.
Right. Yeah, and I do think it depends on which one, like how the size of the project, if it's bigger, using the whiteboard, if not probably as much as him. Mm-hmm. But yep, gotta love the whiteboards.
So you mentioned a little bit working to find interviewees. Do you do most of the work in picking out which employees you're going to interview, or do you leave that more to the client to decide?
Yeah, so I feel like it depends on the project, but a process that we've found that works really well for us is to have the client give us multiple options, because the client may know of an interviewee that is a great employee, they're great at what they do, but they may not be as good of a communicator in front of a camera, right, or whatever. So I think we found that it's helpful to have them maybe give us their top 5 to 8 people. And then I'll usually end up doing, I'll communicate with each of those people and do a pre-interview interview phone call just to kind of get to know them, get to know their story, how they came to work there, what they're passionate about, and just get to know them and kind of figure out, okay, who's going to be the best fit for this story and for this film that we're creating. So often it'll be like that. Sometimes there's only going to be 2 or 3 good options for an interviewee. And so in that case, we'll just go with whoever the client chooses and, kind of make that work. I'll still usually do that pre-interview phone call just so that going into the project, we know what types of questions we want to ask, what their background is, what their story is. And then often on set, I'll be the one doing the actual interview.
Okay.
So I will be the one communicating via email, via phone ahead of time. And then once we're there, Andrew's usually very busy on the creative end. He's working with either just himself or with, if he's brought other crew on, to set up the lighting and prep all of that side of things. And so I try to make the interviewee feel comfortable, just introducing myself and start asking them questions like, oh, where do you live? Tell me about your family, just trying to really make them feel comfortable and having a conversation before the real interview so that Andrew can then focus more on the side of things for that.
Nice. Working with clients, obviously the budget process is a little different. So you found that there are either certain benefits or certain challenges that come with dealing with a client project?
Right, yeah. I would say one of the first things that comes to mind is the fact that you're not working with actors typically on like more of a client project. You do have people that are potentially acting as far as, you're catching them doing what they do in the job, or sometimes we'll have footage of a family, right? Like maybe they're riding their bike in the park together or different things like that. So they are in front of the camera and doing that type of thing. But again, they're working with the client on that. You're not necessarily bringing in actors and stuff like that. So I think that is potentially a benefit to it, is you don't have to have quite as much for like travel costs or costs that go with just having the actors. Often on a client project, you would have less crew. And again, this is depending on the size of the project and the needs of the project. But there's a lot of client work that you can do with just 2 to 3 crew or whatever. So you're not, often for us at least, Andrew's just doing like the interview sound, right? He doesn't have a sound guy that's necessarily hired just for the project to come do that. So I think that's another budget difference, is just crew. I think also on the client stuff, you'll often be a little bit more run and gun, and you're using what the client has available. So you're not spending quite as much on maybe like the locations or the wardrobe, stuff like that. Again, it depends. Like a lot of client stuff does have narrative aspects to it, and we've done client stuff where we're building sets or, working to go try to find wardrobe or props or different things for the project.
Cool. So what is your process like figuring out what crew you're going to need for a project? Because like you said, it's not like a feature film where you have to have all these roles to do the project. It can vary.
Yeah, no, that's really true. I think if I was to say it in one word, it would be budget. So, isn't that every producer's answer to everything, though? Is budget?
Pretty much.
Yeah, basically. But I think especially for us when deciding crew, we'll have those discussions up front with the client. What's their budget? What are we looking at working with? And then I'll go break it down and figure out what I think we could have for crew. But usually a huge determining factor for us is Andrew and I collaborating on that and who he needs for the project, especially since the majority of our projects are probably going to be between 2 to 5 people working on the project. It's really important that Andrew's able to have creatively as a director who he needs on that project. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge factor in determining how many crew members, what types of crew we're going to be getting for that project. So yeah, generally we'll talk about that. I'll hear what he has to say. I'll discover creatively like who he needs, and then I'll tell him maybe what I think. And then typically like I mentioned earlier, I will AD and produce. So there's not always somebody specifically on my team for the project. But the bigger the project gets, the more Andrew and I are pushing to make sure that I do have somebody else on my team.
Okay.
Whether it be even just a PA, so I'm not the one having to always run with snacks and drinks, or me just producing and having somebody else first AD on that project. So the bigger the project, like I said, the more we're going to push to make sure that I have somebody helping out on that on my team. But typically we'll look at the budget and Andrew will decide if he's going to DP it or if he's going to, camera op and do all of that work. If he needs a gaffer, or maybe he just needs a grip, or maybe he needs somebody on art, because each project is so different. But budget is probably the biggest determining factor for us.
Yeah, no, for sure. I feel like as much as people don't want to admit it, even for a lot of narrative projects, that's the big determining factor.
It really is. I think every project we do, Andrew's always wishing we had more. Oh man, I wish we could hire, these 3 more people on this project or buy these props or do this thing. And quick interesting fact that I heard from another producer on that was really helpful for Andrew and I was to look at the budget as a creative tool. So often it's easy for me and Andrew, for him to be pushing for the creative and like, we have to make a great story for the client and we have to get this type of camera and rent this type of gear. And I'm just like, no, we can't do that. We don't have the budget. We don't have the time or we don't have the resources. And instead of me just saying like, well, no, how can I use that budget as a creative tool for Andrew, right? Mm-hmm. Like saying, oh, cool. If you want to rent that type of camera, that'd be great. We're just going to have to shoot for 2 days instead of 5. So kind of giving options and working with him and having a more positive response and not just thinking of the budget as black and white, but more as like that creative tool. Like how can we use the budget to tell the story?
Right. Yeah. No, that it's hard. I was working on budgeting a project this past week, and it's like, this is what I want to do, and trying to figure out what's the best way to be able to do that and stay within a certain budget realm. It's never easy.
It's never enough, is it?
No. I feel like that's almost to some degree a challenge in this industry. It's like you can always have a bigger budget. Hollywood's always pushing the envelope for bigger budget and everything.
Yeah, and so I think it's really important that no matter what size budget you have, you learn how to work within that, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's been really interesting over the past couple of years as our company has grown, our per project budget has grown, right? We've been able to work with more and more clients that have bigger and bigger budgets. And if you would have asked me like a year and a half ago, what would it be like working with a budget that's fill in the blank, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, right? I would have been like, whoa, like that would get us everything we could ever want, right? But it doesn't. Like you're always pushing that envelope, like you were saying, because as soon as you have that bigger budget, then you also have more crew and more flights and you're maybe shooting in a different state or whatever. So I think learning to use that budget wisely in the smaller projects is super helpful because it really doesn't change once the budget gets bigger. You still have to learn how to manage the project and work within that to the best of your ability.
Yes. So I wanted to ask, because over the course of you and Andrew working at Bartlett Idea Co, you've done a lot of projects in a lot of different states. So how have you kind of seen the different states look at film or handle film projects differently? And maybe what are some things people should keep in mind if they're working on a project that's shooting in a different state?
Right. No, that's really good. I feel like, so Andrew and I live in the Midwest, and up here, people generally speaking, and we're not in like Minneapolis or anything. It's more so like, the smaller towns and stuff in our area. And people are generally really excited about a project you're doing. It's generally like, oh, sure, you can use our location. No big deal. You'd have to, of course, be sure to get like a location release form and make sure you've checked your boxes there. but people are generally very excited in the Midwest to see you doing a project. They're glad to work with you. We've done projects in a few other states as well, Indiana and New Mexico. But this last one that we did earlier this year in California was probably like the biggest stretch for me personally, because in California, especially, like they have a very different view of film because people there are so used to it. They're so used to film crews, and probably sadly a lot of film crews who don't pick up after themselves or aren't doing things responsibly. So there's a lot of permits, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of very strict details. You have to know exactly the time and day you're shooting when and where. I'm used to in the Midwest it being more like, oh, if it rains, we can just swap day 2 and 3. No big deal. Like the client will be fine with that. But you can't just do that in California. So something that I really learned on producing that project was just make sure that you are reaching out to other producers or other filmmakers and asking them questions ahead of time. So if you've never shot in that state, or maybe you've never shot with that number of crew, or whatever it is that happens to be new to you, of really asking those questions ahead of time. Because I got some good advice from some different people telling me, like, make sure you get the permits way ahead of time, like 2 to 3 months ahead of time. Like, you want to be on it because it can be very slow. It can be a process. And so hearing that advice ahead of time was really helpful. And I learned so much on that project, but I don't think I could have done it nearly as well without getting that advice from others who had done it before. So that's huge, of just being willing to ask those questions about something that's new to you and giving yourself more time. On the project we did in California, we were shooting in early January. And so all the people that I was writing about permits and locations and some of the stuff that turned out to be very last minute, I'm writing them over the holidays, like over Christmas and New Year's. And so I wish that we wouldn't have maybe planned the project quite so close to the holidays, or at least been able to give the creative side and then the producing side more time to get those done. So even if you think you have plenty of time to get something done, don't put it off. Make sure you're getting that done well in advance, even before the deadline, before you need to, because there's often problems that come up, especially in working in another state, with those permits and locations and weather and any other aspect that you may not be used to where you're coming from.
Okay, yeah, cool. No, I've only produced stuff in the Midwest, so I definitely know what it's like. You reach out to people and you're like, is there any paperwork that we need to fill out? And in the Midwest, sometimes they look at you like a deer in the headlights, like, what are you even talking about? And they have to go ask 3 or 4 people to see if there's a form.
That's really true. And I think too, like, something else that I would recommend if you are going to a state that's unfamiliar, especially California, but a bigger city or state, is making sure, especially if it's a smaller project, that you do have somebody on your team. Because like for me, for that project, I had a first AD, which was amazing. I would not have survived without him taking over that side of things. Mm-hmm. But I wish that I would have hired somebody to work with me on the producing side of things, because it was so new and so overwhelming and there was so many details. So yeah, that's just something I guess that I would have done differently, is to make sure I had more people on my team to help spread the load with all the new things that we were having to deal with and work on in the communication and the permits and all that.
Do you think with doing, like, if you were to bring a person like that on, would you go for somebody or would you try to find somebody that actually like lives and works in that state?
That is a really good question. For starters, let me add that usually on a client project, we will be working with a specific person from that company who will help us with a lot of the local stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So they'll maybe help if we have a question about staying after hours, or a key that's needed, or finding a kid to come ride the bike for this scene or whatever. Like, they'll help us communicate with those local people and with the local locations. So that is super helpful. We do that on probably every project. We'll have somebody from the company that's helping locally with that stuff. I would say I probably would hire somebody that I knew that I worked well with. That would probably be my first choice. But I would also, especially if I was doing something, again, that was in a state I'd never worked in or whatever, I would consider hiring somebody I didn't know as long as I had a personal recommendation.
Okay.
I just know, for at least for me, once I get on set and I'm working with these people, I want to know that it's somebody I work well with and that I can communicate well with. And so either having that personal recommendation, because that could help on budget too. You know, if it is somebody local, they not only know the area, but you're not having to spend some of the budget on flights and all of that. So there are some pluses to that, but definitely, yeah, somebody that I either know or has been personally recommended is who I would go with.
All right, cool. Yeah, no, it's cool to hear your thoughts. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. Join us next time as we continue our discussion with Hannah about Bartlett Idea Co's work with different law enforcement agencies, as well as post-production. Until then, thanks for listening, and make sure to subscribe to the Producer Podcast.